for most of my, certainly my teenage years and most of my 20s, I was fairly numb from the neck down. Like I was, I had emotions, but I didn't have any kind of definition or attunement as to what, like where they were or what I was actually feeling. And a huge
Me
part of
too.
my journey,
Me
right?
too.
And
Yeah,
a huge part of it was actually like realizing there's so many different flavors of sensation that are alive in the body, and increasing that capacity has made the emotional work just like 50 times easier.
Hey, Johnny.
Hey, Joe.
How are you?
I am great. Really good.
I'm glad to hear it. So let's get started. What the fuck is a nervous system in your world, in your terminology?
Yeah, so I'm also really interested to hear your kind of map of this and perspective as well. I think the frame that I like to explore is that our nervous system is like the lens through which we view reality. And that when we're in different nervous system states, our experience of other people, our experience of ourselves, of the world shifts. And being able to kind of map those states and knowing what our nervous system is doing at any point in time is incredibly helpful. And I'm in this conversation, I'm super interested to hear how you think about the nervous system in the work you do, and almost like compare the maps that we have.
Yeah. Okay. I'm happy to share, but I want to dig in a little deeper before I do that. How would you make a distinction between, say, the nervous system and the emotional system and the intellectual system, or the prefrontal cortex or intellect?
Yeah. So I tend to lump the nervous system in with the emotional system. And a lot of my training is informed by breath work and polyvagal theory, which I imagine you've come across, which we can get into if that's relevant. So I tend to see that there are certain emotions which are connected with like safety, with what's known as ventral vagal. There's certain emotions which are connected with like dorsal kind of collapse, freeze states, and then there's other emotions, let's say like frustration or anger, which are more in the sympathetic realm. So I kind of use that as a way of mapping different states.
Okay. And so for the audience, can you give us a brief overview of the polyvagal theory?
Yeah, sure. So it was developed by a guy called Dr. Stephen Porges. He basically says that there are three main branches. There's the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic, and then the parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, that has two branches. One is known as ventral and one is known as dorsal. And the ventral is basically like connection. It's like the place where we can play, we feel safe, we feel grounded, we can make eye contact, we kind of in tune with ourselves. Dorsal is in a kind of low tone, healthy state, is rest and digest. So like when we're sleeping, when we're relaxing, lying down. But it's also responsible for like when we go into freeze or shutdown, which is like a kind of adaptive survival response to stress. And some people, as I'm sure you know in your work, some people, when they get stressed or triggered, they go into either like anger, kind of sympathetic intensity, or they go into like collapse, freeze, kind of shame, shutdown, and like disconnects. So that's generally how I think about it. And the sympathetic is, it's also important to mention that like these states can be online at the same time. So like right now I'm probably in some degree of sympathetic and some degree of ventral, because there's this activation, there's alertness. I'm like talking to you and there's a sense of like, oh, I can feel my body, I can make eye contact with you, I can feel connected. So these states can be blended. It's not just like one on and off switch for each one.
And then you mentioned a third, but you didn't name it.
So ventral, sympathetic, and dorsal. Ventral
Okay.
is like,
so in the theory, ventral and dorsal aren't part of the same. It's an actual third branch. Because I believe that there's some theory out there about the social nervous system too, right? That part of the vagus nerve. And so how does that fit into the...
So the social nervous system is another way of saying the ventral vagal, which is part of the vagus nerve, the vagus brake. Yeah, that's the kind of attuning part where when we feel safe and grounded, that can be online for connection, for play,
Gotcha.
creativity, all those things.
Okay, and then what does a healthy nervous system look like?
So this is a really interesting question. I think some people have this view that like we should be totally regulated and calm the entire time, which might work for some people, but it's I think it's certainly setting unrealistic.
It might work for some people, but I've never seen anybody do it.
So. Neither have I. So the two words that I think are helpful to use are capacity and resilience. Capacity is basically I'm able to hold intensity and I have a strong ventral vagal tone, meaning that I can be with intense experiences without going into shutdown or going into overwhelm.
Yeah.
The other piece is resilience, which is basically how efficiently can you downshift your state of arousal after a stressful experience and find kind of healthy relaxation without relying on substances or crutches or alcohol, whatever it is, which a lot of people do. So a healthy nervous system is basically very dynamic. It responds adaptively to the situation.
Great. And then one more question for you around this is that there's a theory, I'm trying to remember the name of the person, but basically it's like, I think it's in some of the emotional literature of Lowen, but maybe it's the core energetics. There's core dynamics, core energetics. I always get it all confused, but basically like there's a cycle of activity, and part of that cycle of activity is like activation, and then part of the cycle of activity, I think it's like 4 or 5, but I always think about the last 2, which is, so you're finished with something, then there's a release, and then there's a rest.
Yeah.
They're not like release and rest aren't the same thing. They're 2 different things. And so when I hear you talk about how quickly you can get back to like a rested nervous system, in your world, is there getting back to rested nervous system? Is there a release and a relax in it? Is it just a relax? If so, what's the difference between the two? Like to get to that resilience of being able to get back to a restful state.
Yeah. So I think what you're referring to is the activation or the mobilization response, which typically has the kind of intensity, which is the sympathetic. And then, like you say, there's usually the release. And then there is the rest digest, which is where whatever occurred integrates and actually gets rewired in the nervous system. And in terms of how that maps onto polyvagal, the activation is the sympathetic, where there's the intensity. Then the ventral comes online usually during the release. And then it's actually really important, as you say, to have a period, particularly if someone's doing like a breathwork journey or going through an emotional process, that there is that complete like deep rest, which is where the actual kind of rewiring from the point of view of the nervous system takes place. And I believe there's like roughly a 5-hour window of neuroplasticity, which if someone is able to rest deeply after an experience like that, then whatever emerged will kind of go from a state to a trait. It'll get rewired.
Yeah. So just to make it practical for a second, somebody goes into a meeting and they are activated because they get called out on performance, and they go through the activity of the meeting, and let's say it comes out well. They're like, oh, that was good. It's successful in that meeting. What does the release look like? What would a variety of releases look like, and what would the rest look like in a healthy nervous system?
Yeah. So what I could imagine happening is, let's say in the boardroom or in the meeting, they're unable to fully come into contact, but as they walk out, they realize, oh, I'm realizing there's actually a lot of like anger in my system. So let's say they go home later that day, or they find some private space, they're able to let that anger move, and then usually there's a space where like there's a feeling of like, like I feel whatever the tension is, whatever they were experiencing, shifts. And after that, it's usually really helpful to have as much kind of rest or spaciousness as possible for that to integrate.
Great. Yeah, just to say, it reminds me of I think it's like one of the foremost like biathlon, like the people who like cross country ski and shoot or something like that from Norway or something like that.
That's a thing.
And he was saying that like 7 hours a day he just sits and watches television. Not the best way to rest, but that resting was such an important part of him being a gold medalist. Like he said, so underrated. Like I do really intense workouts, but I do a tremendous amount of resting so that I can be at top performance. And I think that a lot of people underestimate that same capacity in doing any kind of self-transformation, how important the rest and not doing is. And something that I notice is when somebody's like critical voice in their head is constantly, they never get the rest. So integration is harder. It's like oftentimes when people change the relationship with the negative voice in their head, their transformation happens quickly. And I think a lot quicker. And I noticed that a lot of that happens because they're actually getting rest. They're not under attack all the time.
There's a phrase that Kevin Kelly says where he shares that most people think about having a good work ethic, but very few people try and cultivate a good rest ethic. And that's honestly that's one of the main pieces in the work that I do with Nervous System Mastery, is helping people to strengthen that like ventral vagal tone, which is basically capacity for rest. It's like how able are we to find safety and actually relax without needing substances. So practices like yoga nidra, NSDR, breathing practices are super helpful for kind of retraining that ability to find relaxation. And what's interesting is the voice in the head will often, like if you change the body, if you change the physiology with a kind of a bottom up approach, the thoughts spiraling tend to kind of diminish naturally. At least that's what I've noticed.
Yeah, I notice it works both ways, actually. Like you can directly address the voice in the head and then it creates more relaxation, or you can use the breath. As I think as somebody said, you can't control your emotions, but you can control your breath, which controls your emotions. And I'm not a huge fan of controlling emotions, but I am a huge, because I think that goes down a very dark, deep rabbit hole of misery. However, I think creating a fertile soil of healthy emotions is a really important thing, which is where I would put I would put the breath work or the yoga, or like, how do you, like, what I would say is, can I create a soil for a healthy lifestyle is a really important piece. As soon as that turns to, I'm going to control my emotions with breath, then it can be very destructive. Then it can be like very up and out and very overriding and denial. A whole bunch of other stuff can happen there.
Yeah, so I actually have a question for you around that. Where do you view the line between, let's say someone is like experiencing a lot of anxiety, like what is the line between beginning with kind of like some kind of self-regulation to allow them to feel grounded enough to kind of even feel their experience and be with themselves, versus you can obviously take that too far and someone they just use let's say a breathing practice to just calm down, but then ignore the underlying emotion. Because I feel like there's risks in both. Like one side, someone could just like get overwhelmed, shut down, and then that's not helpful. But then, like you say, if someone's always using a breathing practice to calm themselves down when they're feeling an emotion, they're likely never going to be able to experience the beauty of that emotion. So how do you think about guiding people through that?
Yeah, so I would add the intellect on it, which you've already actually said, which is like, oh, the negative voice in the head is going to reduce if you're doing the breath work. So they're like, on one level, you have three systems. On another level, it's one system. It's us, right? So, but I think it's a good distinction to break them into the three. And as anybody who's listened to my podcast knows, like, to me, the prefrontal cortex is the very human. It's the very rational. It's the thought-centered area. The emotion is the mammalian part of the brain. And then the nervous system is the part of the brain that's more reptilian. It is that immediate reaction area. And it's a lot of that is in that fight and flight area. And so And so anything that happens in any of them can affect all of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, it's all, you're addressing all three. And so I'll take access points wherever I can get them with somebody, right? So if the breath thing works to get enough access to the other two components, I'll take it. But I'll make sure that the work is done on all three levels as much as possible. So all of our
Mm-hmm.
courses are thinking about it in all three levels. In general, most people in society are far more head oriented. So if you can crack open the intellectual trap that they put themselves in, that's often the first step for people, because that allows them to be able to pay attention to their emotion and or their nervous system. What I notice is, unless they're fully committed, unless for some reason or another they're like, okay, breath work is there, I need to do breath work, and I have the kind of intellectual structure that allows me to have a disciplined approach to something, which is not a huge amount of Americans anyways, then I would rather work on the intellect, deconstruct that enough, deconstruct the stories enough for them to be able to start finding the enjoyment in the breath work, and then they'll do it naturally, or the enjoyment of the emotions, and then they'll do that naturally. But usually the intellect doesn't have enough space for it. However, there's definitely times I'm working with people where it's like the emotion has to be addressed first, or the nervous system has to be addressed first. So if I see somebody who's very, what I would call hysteric, not in a bad word, not hysterical, but it just that terminology is from the Reichian and Lowen work. If I see somebody in that hysteric, then that nervous system work is going to be really, really critical for them.
Mm-hmm.
So they're the people who are kind of, in a society, they seem a little more flighty. They seem like they like are interacting with like crystals and energy more. Like typically they're like, their emotions typically are bigger. They're like that kind of human being. Then nervous system work is a really good, important first step for them, because they'll they have they're so in touch with it that they'll feel that breath and immediately react and know, oh, this is a good thing that I can enjoy and do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of, it's more person by person situation. In general, the idea is to give them all three tools and allow them to work on all three tools instead of just doing one. And I think that's generally the issue with most work out there, is that they're working on one or maybe two of the places. And so really effective for some people, but there's a missing component for others. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And at some point, I think, you know, I view it. So I had a teacher, I can't remember who it was, say that they thought development was like a bunch of pencils with rubber bands. And you could like pull one of the pencils up, but there was like the tension of the other ones. And so on one level, you pull one pencil up and then everything else wants to come up. But if it's down, there's this tension. And so there was a certain way in which development worked where you had to kind of work on all the pencils so that there wasn't creating this tension between them. And so I notice, like, if I'm working with somebody who's done a tremendous amount of intellectual work or a tremendous amount of emotional work, then the nervous system work, when they find it, it just makes huge difference really, really quickly. Right? Because there's that tension has been built. They've got some really tense rubber bands, and all of a sudden, like, it can make a huge difference because it up levels everything.
And how do you distinguish between the nervous system work and the emotional work? Like, what's that line for you?
Yeah. So the way I think about it is, it's like a bit of causation. Like when you said, oh, I'm not great at the terminology you're using. I apologize. I did read the theory book like a while ago. It's an older book, right? It's like, I think it's at least a decade old or something.
Several. Yeah.
Yeah. It was given to me by a really amazing craniosacral practitioner, just a mind-blowing one. You'd sit and you just walk out of there just completely shifted. And so he was the one that gave me the book, and his work was so effective I had to read it, but it's been so long. But basically you were talking about how one of those things could have two different emotional outputs, right? Like the way I would say it is like you could do freeze or fight or flight, like depending. For me, those are three different, and because there's three different emotional reactions to that, instead of just one emotional reaction to that, that's how I kind of layer the cause and effect. So for instance, and if you think about how they're built on top of each other, it's like the nervous system is kind of the primary quickest reaction. And you know that from the studies that of like people can react without ever going into the intellect whatsoever. Like just have a snake jump at you and you know what your nervous system is because you'll be halfway across the room before you even realize there was a snake. And so, so to me, it's like a cause and effect chain. So for instance, I could have the thought, my boss loves me, and I could have, lots and lots of emotional reaction. There could be like a plethora of emotional reactions to that. And so to me, the primary level is the nervous system. The secondary level is the emotional system. And the third is the intellect. However, the dance goes both ways, meaning I can have like every time a certain thought hits my brain, a certain emotion is going to come up, and it can go every time I have a certain emotion, I go, oh, that, and I tie it to a thought. So both of them can come up. Like you'll see people, they get a little agitated because they haven't had enough food, and then they'll start a fight and everything will start looking binary in their world. Right. And it's just like,
Yep.
So, but the way I would look at it is generally, if I was to say what the nervous system was, I'd say the nervous system is close to like fight or flight, as fight, flight, or freeze as you can get. And then the emotional level is on a muscular level. So it's like you hold the emotions in the muscles, and then the intellect is the world of thoughts. And they're all dancing with each other.
Yeah. That reminds me of an experience I had during a meditation retreat where I was still enough that I could notice when a certain looping thought would arise, there was a corresponding tension in my body, and kind of really mapping that connection and seeing those things co-arising was fascinating. And I think that was another piece that I wanted to mention in this conversation is the idea of interoception and building this somatic awareness, because for most of my, certainly my teenage years and most of my 20s, I was fairly numb from the neck down. Like I was, I had emotions, but I didn't have any kind of definition or attunement as to where they were or what I was actually feeling. And a huge part of my journey, right? And a huge part of it was actually like realizing there's so many different flavors of sensation that are alive in the body, and increasing that capacity has made the emotional work just like 50 times easier. Because for me, at least, if I'm feeling something, I may pay attention to the story, but more often than not, and I see you in the life coaching, like you'll see when they go into the head, and then you're like, okay, bring it back down into the body. What's the sensation? And that's, at least in my experience, usually what enables it to move, by actually feeling the interoceptive sensations that are associated with whatever the emotion is.
Yeah. For me, there's kind of a phased, depending on where you are with the emotional work. There's the identification piece. To be able to identify it is really useful. And then to be able to have the somatic experiencing of it is another really important piece. To be able to express it is another, to actually have the movement and the expression of it is another really important piece. And then to see that it is not particularly cause and effect related is another really important piece. Like that, like you were saying something to the effect of, I realized every time I had a thought, I had a corresponding somatic experience. What I've also noticed is that's true. And then that thought leaves, and then a replacement thought comes in and then creates that experience. So for instance, I had a relationship with my father that for a long time, every time I thought about my dad, I had the somatic experience of like, oh, I'm not getting enough of his love somatically, right? And I stopped living with my dad, and that got replaced with money. Oh, I'm not getting enough money, and the same somatic experience occurred. So there's this, just anyways, a really cool relationship between that, so that it's It is like a dance between the three for me, for sure. Yeah. I have another question. This is a question I've never gotten a good answer from anybody. So no,
Oh,
and I don't
Jesus.
have a good answer for it
No
either.
pressure.
But yeah, exactly. And I think it's, if I look at just even the research on it, for instance, it's like the intellectual cognitive development has like so much work, so much like research behind it. And then the emotional stuff is far thinner. It's starting to get popular now, but the emotional stuff is far thinner. The nervous system
Agreed.
is pretty thin. The very worst is the energetic system. So what is in your mind, if you can create a distinction between like energetic and a nervous system, if there is one, what's the distinction for you between an energetic system and a nervous system?
Yeah, wow, that is a tough question.
Right.
So experientially, I'll say that I only even became aware that the energetic system was a thing during the breathwork training, where it became obvious that by moving breath or breathing in certain ways, there was more aliveness, sensation in certain parts of my body. And the more that I meditated and the more that I did the breath work, the more that even became a thing. And so I think I'll preface this by saying, like, for most people, they might not even know what feeling their energetic system might be like. So I actually listened to a really interesting podcast recently with a guy called Dr. Jack Kruse, and he's a very kind of contrarian type figure, but he talked about this theory that our cells, our mitochondria, actually produce light. They're kind of like light factories, and that it is in theory possible, and I think this has been done in non-human cells, to measure the very low bandwidth of light that is created by these cells. And so, like, the working theory that I have, and I have absolutely zero proof of this, is that when cells are healthy, they are kind of releasing this low bandwidth of light. And that when we have trapped emotion, trauma, incomplete reflexes from childhood, that in some ways reduces that area's capacity to produce light, produce energy. And that by going through these somatic releases, these processes, we're kind of rejuvenating the cells in that way. In terms of defining the energy system, I mean, without kind of going to Chinese medicine or some of the more like esoteric literature, I don't think that modern science has a compelling definition, which is largely why it's mostly ignored, right? There's very little, most people get laughed out of the room if they start talking about the energy body in a neuroscientific way.
Yeah, it's amazing that. So to me, I think when I like look at anything, like if someone's talking about science or emotion or dreams or energy work, or like they have a language that makes sense to them, but it doesn't really make sense to potentially other people who are speaking other languages. And so you can look at something like the energy body, and like you said, there's not a really great definition, but you can see scientific research about how Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Tibetan medicine, or traditional Chinese medicine has really good results in things like ulcers. So there's a system that's completely based on the energetic body that has really good results, but we still don't particularly have a definition or know how to work with energy. And it is like the only thing that I could do in a session that would like turn more people off than like, like, let's talk about your chakras. Is to be like, let's talk about God and how like Jesus's wisdom. It's one of those things that creates those particular languages create so much defense in the system. And I think for good reason, frankly. I think that there's been a lot of attack. A lot of people have been attacked through the language of religion, and a lot of people have been attacked through the language of energy, right? It's like this, you just have bad energy, so I can't be around you. And it's like, what the fuck do I do with that? Like, you know what I mean? It's like this thing that's undefined, that somebody apparently understands that you don't understand, that you're being condemned / judged for, and you can't, there's no way to protect
Mm-hmm.
yourself. And so I feel like there's good reason why people get really defensive around that languaging.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
And I think there's a couple of like the other two interesting directions that are, I think, like pointing to this. Both the research with HeartMath, where they'll kind of they will measure I believe it's the electromagnetic resonance of the heart,
That's what
and
they're measuring.
you can kind of track people's heart rate variability will entrain when they're singing together,
Yep.
or dog owners and their dogs, their HRV will also entrain when they're in kind of sympathetic resonance with each other. And I think that is one way in which it is measurable. There are kind of like charts you can see where these numbers become aligned. So I think that's one way. And then the other is that during these kind of let's say practices like using breath work as an example that create these altered states of consciousness, there are both kind of certain brainwave states and also changes in the blood chemistry which can be measured quite easily, which correlate with these kind of energetic experiences that people report. And so I think that there's almost like adjacent things that we can measure and quantify, which like point to there being there. And we're several years, maybe decades away from being able to actually like take a photo of it or measure it in a meaningful way, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I mean, the amazing thing is that as the one, like, so for instance, like you do certain breath work, then your nitrogen level in your blood goes up. It has a certain experience, like you can feel like your body tingle. You can call that an energetic state, or you can call that a like increased nitrogen in my blood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
on one level, it's like the energetic system, or the people trying to describe the energetic system, it's like, to me, it's like they are describing something that's potentially happening scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
But when science defines it, they're not going to define it as energetic. They're going to define it as, and that's the thing that I think happens in all of the areas, is that like, because we're one system, this like language is learning to describe the whole system. The intellect
Mm-hmm.
describes a part of the system a lot better than the energetic system. The energetic system, but will describe something a lot better than the intellectual system. But over
Mm-hmm.
time, like you can see that they're pointing often to very similar things with different language.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you're also right that like the art of I guess the work that we do is kind of finding the languaging that resonates with the person. Like if they're doing a yoga teacher training, the energy stuff might resonate, and if they're
Exactly
leading a company, it's probably going to be more on the intellect or the somatic realm.
That's right. So tell me how, so you've been pretty dedicated to this nervous system path for how long?
I'd say kind of 3 to 5 years, depending on how you define it.
Great. We'll define it as 5 years. And what what's the changes? What has shifted?
What has shifted for me?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'd say that like I have a background I was a startup founder 11, 12 years ago. I went through a burnout experience, and then 6.5 years ago, I lost my fiance. She had an anxiety attack and ended up taking her own life. And that kind of journey through grief really like completely opened me up to like my entire emotional experience. And I realized how numb I'd basically been for the last 5 to 10 years. And yeah, and in the process of discovering meditation, breath work, and then more recently how the nervous system kind of ties those together, I mean, I feel like a completely different human. I think my life has changed fundamentally, and I actually find it in some ways difficult to relate to myself 10, 15 years ago. But tangible pieces are like the quality of connection in relationships is beyond anything that I think even comprehended when I was younger. I think that's been a huge piece. The capacity for joy and honestly love as well. And the kind of the way in which I think my body is constantly giving me feedback about any moment or experience. And as you guys teach with, decision making, and like I used to be the guy that made a spreadsheet with like ranking things with like 1 to 10 and like weighted variables, and just really like doubling down on the intellect for everything. And now I just move through the world in a very different way. And I think another piece as well is confidence in my capacity in new situations. Like before, I think if I was triggered, I would, like, especially in social situations, I'd shut down and I'd feel very kind of like almost like a victim of my own body in ways. And now having both kind of toolkits to downregulate if needed, or even better, just like feel the thing in the moment and then move through. That's been life changing as well. So I mean, there's so many areas that my life has shifted, and I'd say also the doing somewhere between 150 to 200 breathwork journeys with this guy in Bali. His name's Ed Dangerfield. Kind of coming into relationship and learning to love, as you guys teach, like loving these different emotions that previously I'd disowned. I think initially for me it was grief, and then anger, and then shame, and then helplessness. And I can kind of track my journey to exploring those emotions in a somatic way and learning to welcome them more fully.
Yeah. And how has been your journey of teaching it to others? What has been the, like, for those who don't know, Johnny has a nervous system mastery class, and my question is, like, what has that been? How have you personally changed by that in that process?
I would say in a number of ways. One, I feel like I've kind of found work that I truly love, in that it feels like the intersection between communicating complex kind of scientific ideas in ways that land and resonate with people, sharing some of my own story and kind of what has been important in my life, and seeing the impact that that's had on other people, and feeling the kind of, I guess, like satisfaction and joy of other people having meaningful breakthroughs and experiences in their life. So that's been immensely rewarding. And it's also been, like, as with I think any business or work, it's been its own arena of challenges, particularly in the early days. Like I remember the first time I did a workshop for like 100 people online, and I was in Mexico at the time, and the town had power cuts every like once a week. And there was a power cut that had, and there were like 100 people on a Zoom call, and some of them were like CEOs and leaders and stuff. And I like raced down to my friend's house to get this like backup generator, and just like ran back and managed to get the power back on. But like I was in a state. I was just like, just like so like expanding my capacity, let's say, in that experience. And now, I think now I feel much more comfortable leading groups of that size, and much more, I'd say, if I had to kind of pin it down to one thing, there's more trust in life and more trust in myself to show up in a way that that where things work out and flow.
One of the things that I really appreciate about you as a teacher that I don't see with a lot of teachers is that you're transparent about your learning process. So you're not like, when I see you on Twitter or when I see you out in the world, I would say you're far more interested in learning than teaching. Like if I just look at the time spent, maybe it's because in the situations I see you, but even on Twitter, I see you more interested in learning almost than teaching, and also very much happy to share what you're learning, even if it's not a part of your teaching.
Yeah.
And so which is rare for teachers. A lot of times teachers get caught in the kind of the knowing aspect of things and not in the like learning aspect of things. And I think there's at some point also a natural tendency that happens after years of doing something that you have to be really specific about who you learn from, right? So that, like, everybody wants to teach you, but that cannot always be a useful or fruitful thing. So yeah, I'm just wondering, like, so the question behind that is that natural? Was that a learning? Is there been a bit of a dance with that? What's been your experience and journey with the being a learner and being a teacher and finding that balance?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think the honest answer is I love learning, and very selfishly, I think part of the reason that I'm doing what doing what I'm doing is that it's a fantastic excuse to continue learning. Like, it gives me a platform to invite people like yourself and other genuine specialists and experts in other fields that I can then learn in real time with them in front of a big group of people. And so I kind of view both the podcast that I have and the course as like a forcing function to continue my own learning. I think that there's certainly a point where like you can kind of, or I can gain a certain level of like, I feel like this topic makes sense to me now. And then for me, it's like, okay, what's the next experiment? What's the next thing I want to really learn about and go deep in? And, recently I've been fascinated in neurodivergence, and there's a number of students that come in with ADHD with different, a constellation of different symptoms. And I find it fascinating talking to them, figuring out like how their experience maps onto what I know. And I just like, I would hate to one day become like an expert and stop learning. Like, that actually terrifies me a little bit.
Yeah, me too.
And I think something that I heard on your podcast, you guys were speaking about this, about how that kind of teacher student dynamic can create disconnection in a way.
Yes.
And whilst I think it's obviously important to present with a level of professionalism and expertise, the more that I am able to like view my students as people that I learn from as well, the less that disconnection happens.
Yeah. You spoke a little bit about the breath work. You said you kind of offhandedly said I did X amount of journeys, and breath journeys can be a whole, I mean, I think you know this. I did breath work like every week, if not every other week, depending on my travel schedule, for like 7 years, like hour-long sessions. So, and I did this.
I didn't know it was that much.
Yeah. So, it was one of the she's past dead, but she was one of the last she told me, and I couldn't find anything that said any different, was that she was the last person who was doing kind of the pure Reich breath work, that hadn't taken the Reich breath work and like modified it.
Right.
I think a lot of the modifications that have been done to it, like Lowen's work, I think is great. So I'm not suggesting that it was better by any stretch, but I've also done a whole bunch of other kind of breath work in my life, like coherent breathing and all sorts of, I have a book this big of like an Indian breathwork person, and I'll like literally, that my friend gave me, and I'll just like open it up and I'll be like, let's try that for a bit, and I'll try it and see what it does to my system. So what do you mean by breathwork journeys, and what's the result in your mind? Like, what's that, not the result, but what's the experience like for one of your breathwork journeys?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's helpful to categorize breathwork into, like, there's many categories, but the two main ones in my mind are like the kind of real time shifting, like either upshifting or downshifting your state. So something like triangular breathing or humming will calm people down, or if you do like breath of fire, Kapalabhati, Wim Hof, hyperventilation, that will amp people up and you'll feel more alert. So that's,
can we just stop for a second? Can we just stop for a second? So everybody who's listening, just big deep breath in. That's what he's talking about, as far as like a breath to regulate a state. Your state is different after a single deep breath in. I just I love that visceral experience, not just the explanation. Okay.
Yeah, it's great. and you can I mean we could do like another full breath, and then humming on the exhale also releases nitric oxide, and that's one of the most effective ways of downshifting is just like a long hum all the way to the end of your breath. And again, you'll feel so much different after just one or two hums.
Want to do it?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay.
Okay. We'll do one just because we don't want it to be too boring.
Yeah, get comfy. Okay. So full breath in through the nose, inhale. And then humming through the nose.
Fuck that. It feels too good. Let's do another.
The rest of the podcast will just be Joe and Johnny humming for 20 minutes.
Felt good to us. Yeah, it has that same thing with that's like the Ujjayi breath has that same thing where it like you can feel it like toning the vagus nerve, vagal, whatever. I'm not good with words, but yeah, the nerve the constriction that the hum causes also creates like a vibration in that nerve corridor. That's cool. I've never done that one.
Yeah. No, it's great. I did it this morning in the cold tub as I was like trying to find my breath. Anyhow, so that's one category. And the other category has many names, but like transformational breathing is the general category. And that includes like holotropic, Reichian, conscious connected breathing, rebirthing. There's all different types of names. The particular branch that I trained under was called facilitated breath repatterning, which is a form of conscious connected breathing, but the practitioner will basically read the breath during a journey and make certain adjustments, certain verbal cues, nerve flossing, different things to both create more ease in the exhale and sometimes more activation and energy on the inhale. And generally speaking, once someone kind of drops into this circular breathing pattern, the journeys go from anywhere between an hour to 2 hours. And once someone's kind of dropped into the breath, these incomplete reflexes or like stored emotions will tend to kind of rise to the surface. And for me, it was almost like layers of an onion. Like one thing would come, I would move, express whatever the thing needed to be felt would feel, and then there was a brief integration, and then the next piece would come up, and it was just like so many different things would arise. And for me, it's always like, I don't recommend that people do this online because I think there's a huge amount to be gained from having an in-person facilitator, like really out of safety reasons, such that if something big arises, they can be there to help co-regulate and help you to ground.
Totally agree. Yeah, we do our version of breath work, but we'll only do it in our in-person stuff.
Yeah. I think it's really important, and also having a high facilitator to breather ratio as well. In the place that I trained, it's 1-4.
We do 1-3, 1-4.
Yeah,
I totally agree with you. Gotta have it.
Yeah,
because I've seen people go comatose. I've seen people have like massive trauma response. I've seen so much puking, so much stuff happens in those rooms. You really want
completely
high ratio.
And it's not that, I know there's people out there that do, breath work to like crowds of like 200 or 300 people, and it will work in the sense that like big emotions can arise. But what we talked about earlier with that mobilization kind of cycle, it's much harder for people, especially if they don't have that kind of down regulation capacity to feel through and to find the ease and calm and integration on the other side. So I've known people that have done some of these holotropic, let's say, and then they've been in this kind of semi-triggered state for the next like several weeks or even months, and they found it really hard to downshift. So
I worked with somebody who did some version of a breathwork journey and didn't sleep for fucking a decade.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No doubt there is like, and I would offer that there's one, not knowing how to downregulate is part of it, but there's also, or a trauma gets released and they don't know how to actually integrate the trauma is
Hmm.
another potential thing.
Hmm.
And so there's a re-traumatization that happens. But there's another too, which is like, you brought all this stuff up, but you didn't heal it. So
Mm.
maybe it doesn't re-traumatize, but like, great, you had the experience. And I've seen this with both some drugs that'll do, or medicines that'll do the same thing, and breath work, where they get these big states, they get these big outs, but there's no integration of it. So you're not actually seeing transformation of a person over time.
Mm.
I did another ayahuasca journey and I had this other big experience, but like the way you're living, your relationship, your friends, like your level of connection, your level of emotional fluidity, your thought patterns aren't particularly changing.
Hmm.
I've seen the same thing with breath work, where someone's doing breath work that doesn't have the integration care afterwards, where they're having big experiences, but they're not actually integrating into transformation or development.
Yeah, absolutely. And one interesting piece that I love about breathwork in particular is that if you're breathing someone, especially in a one-on-one capacity, you can see the changes in their breath kind of before and after, and you can tell has that has that thing landed, has it been integrated by the way that they're breathing. And if they come for another session the next day or the next week, then it's like you can see if that actually landed in their system. Whereas with a lot of other modalities, particularly psychedelics, things like that, it's very difficult to know, like, was there actually a meaningful shift, or was it just a big cathartic release that didn't have any, like, lasting impact on them as a human.
On integration. Yep. So I know that at one point I was suggesting that you might do some live in person ones. Has that happened, or do you have plans for it in
Mm.
the future?
Yeah, I've been doing one-on-one sessions with people here in Boulder.
Oh,
um
great.
mostly mostly friends, and also the odd kind of client as well,
Awesome.
which is kind of a good mix, because I do really miss that the in-person live interaction that I know you get with Groundbreakers,
Yeah.
which has felt like a good balance for me.
Oh, that's great. Fantastic. Glad to hear it. Yeah. I mean, that absolutely changed my whole world. That's the 7 years that I did. I mean, it changed the way that I had an orgasm. It changed the way I laughed. It
Mhm.
changed
Mhm.
my
Yeah.
capacity to my resilience, my stress level. It changed so much. My armoring, the physical musculature armoring. It had a huge
Mm.
impact. That seven
Yeah.
years. A lot of the impact happened in the first little bit because I was very ripe, and then there was just like something that happened like over time. That
Mhm.
there was an eroding and a wearing away that happened over time that was really useful.
Yeah,
But,
it's interesting you mentioned laugh. Like, both my laugh and my voice have changed. Even
yeah.
I listened to a podcast episode I did 4 years ago, and my voice sounds noticeably different then compared to how it sounds now. And I think a lot of that is because the tension in my lower belly and lower diaphragm has, a lot of it's kind of been released.
Gone. And so when you're doing your breath work, I could geek out, like inhale, exhale, body position. Like I could completely geek out,
Mhm.
but it would bore the crap out of everybody. But at some point, I'd love to chat with you about it. But
Yeah.
I'm just curious, when you're doing the in-person breath work and you're watching somebody breathe, are you making adjustments in any way to help them deepen into their breaths? Or is it is it an interactive thing, or is it like a prescription thing?
No, it's constant real-time adjustments. So there's hands on the body, usually most of the time. And generally what we're looking for is both seeing, like, what is someone's window of tolerance, what is their capacity, and keeping them within that window.
Yeah.
And then titrating, or pendulating is another term, the breath to either increase more energy, usually by, like, deepening the inhale,
Yeah.
sometimes getting, like, hands under the rib cage and allowing more air to go into the upper lungs,
Yeah.
or more often than not, especially with kind of type A high achievers, it's helping them find ease in the exhale. So often people will have, like, holding in their throat or
Oh,
their
wow. It's
lower belly
really
with,
similar. It's really
oh,
similar to the work that I do. I'm sorry to interrupt,
oh,
but
interesting.
yeah,
No, that
it's all
doesn't
for me.
surprise
It's the
me.
same thing. It's the most full breath, inward capacity breath, like a
Yep.
stretching. Like, how do you increase both in the belly and the chest and other places, but like, and how do
Yep.
you release with no effort?
Exactly.
Okay, so it's
Yeah.
really actually really similar. Fascinating.
And then finding out what are all of the blocks and tension to either a full kind of vibrant inhale or a relaxed effortless exhale.
That's
And
right.
usually starting around the rib cage and then kind of working up or down depending on, and also, you know, bearing in mind how many sessions is someone going to do, and do you want to open up a big piece knowing that you'll have 3 or 4 or 5 sessions afterwards to help integrate it if something big arises.
Well, I could geek out. And after we
Yeah, me
turn this
too.
up, I want to keep on be real. I mean, as in a be real, not as in the media, social media thing. I think, I don't know if we have much more time for another question. How are we doing? I can't read time. Oh yeah, we're done. Okay. I have to go to another podcast. So it was
Oh, cool.
a total pleasure to have you. Is there anything that you want to leave our audience with? Any thought process, any good wishes, or tell them about anything you're doing?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. This has been so fun. I have a podcast as well called Curious Humans Podcast. You've been a guest. If you enjoy this conversation, there's a chance that might resonate too. And yeah, and if people want to learn more about the Nervous System Mastery course, we have a spring cohort coming up in mid-March, and the website is nsmastery.com. And I love seeing how much overlap there is between our two communities. There's a bunch of people joining that have taken AOA, and I know vice versa. So it's really cool to see that overlap.
Very sweet. Yeah. Pleasure to have you on, Johnny.
Yeah, you too, Joe.
Yeah, pleasure. All right. See you soon.